Marcus Hill. That name once carried weight in the Marines. A sniper whose precision saved entire squads. A man trusted with missions no one else wanted. He had spent years in deserts and mountains, waiting in silence, pulling the trigger only when it meant saving lives. His country had trained him to endure hunger, cold, fear, and penet. Nothing prepared him for what happened the night he came home. It started on an ordinary evening. Marcus was walking down a quiet street in his hometown, still in the same state where he had enlisted years ago. His broad shoulders carried the weight of memory and service, but also a quiet pride. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried himself like a Marine, disciplined, respectful, sharp. His wallet carried his veteran's ID. His jacket pocket carried a folded photograph of his squad. Men he had once called brothers. The flashing red and blue lights broke the calm. A police cruiser rolled up slowly, the tires crunching against gravel. The window slid down, and a voice barked out, "Hey, stop right there." Marcus froze, not because of guilt, but because old instincts told him never to make sudden moves around authority. He turned calmly, hands visible, a small, polite nod on his face. "Evening, officers," he said. His voice was steady, his tone respectful. But the officers didn't see a veteran. They didn't see a Marine who had been trained to defend them. They didn't see a man who carried scars, visible and invisible, from serving his country. They saw only a black man walking alone at night. ID now. The first officer snapped. Marcus complied, moving slowly so there'd be no misunderstanding. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to show his veteran's ID and driver's license. The plastic glimmered under the streetlights. It should have ended there, but it didn't. One officer glanced at the card, then sneered. "This doesn't mean anything. What are you doing around here?" "My mother lives 3 blocks over," Marcus replied calmly. "I was visiting her. I'm headed home now." The second officer circled behind him, hand resting on his holster. "We've had reports of suspicious activity. You fit the description." Marcus had heard that line before. Too many men who looked like him had. He swallowed the heat rising in his chest. "Officer, I assure you, I haven't done anything. I'm just trying to get home." But before his words could settle, one of them barked, "Hands behind your back." The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. With a cruel finality, the steel bit into his skin. He felt the humiliation instantly. He had been trained to subdue enemies in combat. Yet here he was, treated like one. Passers-by slowed their steps. A couple stared, their faces torn between discomfort and fear. One man pulled out his phone, recording silently, his eyes wide. Another shook his head and kept walking, unwilling to get involved. Marcus wanted to shout, to explain who he was, what he had done, the sacrifices he had made. But a Marine doesn't beg. A Marine doesn't plead. He clenched his jaw, standing tall even as the officers pushed him toward the squad car. Still, inside, something broke. These were the same streets he had defended from afar, while bullets snapped over his head and mortar shook the ground. These were the same streets he had dreamed of returning to during endless nights overseas. He had believed America would welcome him back with gratitude, but gratitude was nowhere in sight tonight. Instead, he was shoved into the back of a patrol car like a criminal, the cuffs cutting deeper into his wrists. He stared through the window as the lights of his hometown blurred by. He thought about his medals locked away in a drawer at home, proof of his service. Proof that meant nothing. To the men driving him away, the officer in the passenger seat glanced back, smirking. "Thought you were tough, huh? Not so tough now." Marcus didn't reply. His silence was louder than words. He knew anything he said would be twisted, used against him. So he let the silence sit heavy in the car, heavier than any bullet he ever fired. When they reached the station, the cuffs were yanked off, only to be replaced with paperwork and accusations. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, lies written on paper, but lies with power. Marcus stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the booking room, hands trembling, not with fear, but with rage and disbelief. This was his country, the country he bled for, and now it treated him like an enemy. But deep down, a fire lit in his chest. He knew this wasn't the end of the story. He knew something bigger was coming. Something that would shake the very walls of the courtroom. And when it did, the world would finally see Marcus Hill not as a suspect, not as a stereotype, but as a man who had already paid the highest price for justice and freedom. So let me ask you, what would you have done if you saw it happen right there on the street? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have walked by, silent? Drop your answer in the comments, because this story is just beginning. The morning sun poured through the narrow windows of the county courthouse, yet for Marcus Hill it might as well have been darkness. He had not slept, not truly. The holding cell reeked of stale sweat, concrete, and despair, and every clang of the steel doors during the night reminded him that he was no longer a Marine sniper, no longer a decorated veteran, but a man stripped of dignity and labeled a criminal. His wrists still bore the raw red marks from the handcuffs, and his mind repeated the same question over and over. How could this be happening in his own hometown? When they led him into the courthouse, he walked in silence, shoulders straight, chin high. He still carried himself like a Marine, even in the shackles of humiliation. The bailiff's hand rested lightly on his arm, guiding him toward the chamber doors, as if Marcus might try to flee. But Marcus didn't think of fleeing. He thought of his mother, who had wept when she found out he had been arrested. He thought of his father, who never lived long enough to see his son in uniform. He thought of the brothers he had lost overseas, men whose names were etched into his memory like scars. The double doors creaked open, and the courtroom seemed to inhale as he entered. Conversations paused. Eyes turned. For a moment, the silence was louder than any gavel. He wore the same suit he had used for funerals of fallen comrades, pressed neatly as though he was trying to cling to some shred of honor. On his chest, tucked into his breast pocket, was a folded paper letter from his commanding officer, praising his service. Marcus had considered leaving it behind, but in the end, he brought it. He thought maybe, just maybe, it would matter. The gallery whispered in fragments, "Isn't that? Wait, wasn't he in the military? Why is he in chains?" He heard it all without responding. His eyes swept over the crowd, some curious, some judgmental, some uncomfortable. A few veterans recognized him, or at least recognized the way he walked, the way his presence filled the room. One older man in the back nodded respectfully, though he said nothing. Others simply looked away. Silence is easier than courage. The officers who had arrested him stood by the wall, arms crossed, smugness painted across their faces. To them, he was no different from any other man they had dragged off the street. His service, his sacrifice, was invisible to them. The judge adjusted his glasses, peering down from the bench as Marcus was led to the defendant's table. "Mr. Hill," the judge said, his tone neither kind nor cruel, merely procedural. "You stand accused of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" Marcus swallowed, the dryness in his throat making it difficult to speak. He looked at the judge directly, refusing to lower his gaze. "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice carried the weight of deserts, jungles, and nights spent in silence with a rifle trained on an unseen enemy. But the words seemed to fall flat. In the courtroom, the prosecutor shuffled papers, his expression cold, prepared to build a narrative that painted Marcus as a threat. Marcus could already sense the script. They would describe him as aggressive, uncooperative, dangerous. They would twist his silence into defiance, his strength into intimidation, his dignity into arrogance. He could feel the tension in the air. Some of the spectators leaned forward, curious. Others leaned back, uncomfortable. The veterans in the room exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The widow of a soldier, seated quietly near the front, whispered to herself, so softly, "Marcus barely caught it. This isn't right." Her voice was almost drowned by the shuffle of papers and the squeak of wooden benches, but Marcus heard it. That whisper was the only sound in the room that felt like truth. The bailiff called for order, as murmurs rippled across the gallery. The judge tapped his gavel once, impatiently. "This is a courtroom, not a forum. Let's proceed." Marcus stood taller, straightening his back. The humiliation burned, but so did the fire inside him. He wasn't here to beg for sympathy. He wasn't here to collapse under the weight of false charges. He was here because injustice had dragged him into this room. And though no one knew it yet, this would not be just another case, just another day in court, because something was coming, something that would make every whisper stop, every smug smile vanish, every silent bystander regret their silence, and, when it happened, the very walls of that courtroom would shake. If you were sitting in that gallery, would you have spoken up? Or would you have lowered your eyes and stayed silent like so many others? Let me know in the comments, because the choice to stay quiet or speak out is what divides courage from complicity. The prosecutor rose slowly, his chair scraping against the polished floor, the sound sharp enough to cut through the hushed murmurs of the room. He gathered his papers in deliberate motions, as though every second was designed to establish control. Then he stepped forward, turning toward the judge with a self-assured look that said he had done this 100 times before and expected the outcome to be no different this time. "Your Honor," he began, his voice slick, rehearsed, almost theatrical. "We are here because Marcus Hill," he paused, letting the name hang in the air, chose to resist lawful commands. He chose to disrupt the peace. He chose to escalate. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Chose. The word hit like a slap. He hadn't chosen anything. He had complied, step by step, showing his ID, moving slowly, keeping calm. He knew how fragile these encounters could be, how one wrong move could cost him his life. He had lived too long under the weight of discipline to be reckless. Yet here, in this room, his restraint was being turned into defiance. The prosecutor tapped his papers. With his index finger, a subtle gesture meant to punctuate his authority. The officers involved reported aggressive behavior. They reported Mr. Hill was uncooperative. They feared for their safety. That last line brought a sharp, bitter laugh in Marcus's mind. Feared for their safety. 2 armed men, badges on. Their chests, with the law backing their every move, feared him, a man walking home. Hands visible, carrying nothing but a wallet, and the memory of wars fought for the same country that now sat in judgment of him. Marcus clenched his fists under the table, the metal edge biting into his skin. He remembered firefights overseas, bullets snapping overhead, the deafening sound of mortar. He remembered pulling wounded brothers to safety, never once thinking about fear, only duty. And now, here, in his own country, his presence alone was being painted as a threat. The judge nodded, scribbling notes. The sound of the pen scratching paper echoed louder than it should have. Every stroke felt like another nail closing a door that Marcus couldn't push open. Disorderly conduct. The prosecutor continued, his tone rising just enough for the gallery to hear clearly. Resisting arrest. 2 charges, both clear violations of the law. This is not about his past, Your Honor. This is about his actions on that night. The words were carefully chosen, calculated to erase everything Marcus had been. His years of service, his sacrifices, his loyalties didn't exist in that moment. The prosecutor wanted the court to see only the ink on a report, not the man standing in front of them. Marcus slowly rose to his feet. His attorney whispered for him to sit back down, but Marcus's pride wouldn't let him. His voice was steady, deep, and carried the weight of every sleepless night, every drop of sweat and blood shed on foreign soil. I served my country with honor, Marcus said, his eyes locked on the judge. The room went still. No shuffling of papers, no whispers, not even the faintest cough, just those 6 words. The prosecutor tilted his head, unimpressed. Your Honor, while we respect his service, it does not excuse breaking the law. Marcus didn't break eye contact with the judge. His voice softened, but his words cut deeper. When I was overseas, I carried out orders without hesitation. I did so to protect people who will never even know my name. I followed the rules. I respected the uniform. And now I stand here accused of crimes I did not commit. For walking home after visiting my mother, some in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The widow near the front wiped her eyes discreetly with a handkerchief. The older veteran in the back clenched his jaw, staring at the floor. They knew what Marcus was saying was true, but truth in a courtroom is not always enough. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone. Mr. Hill, this court is not here to judge your service. It is here to judge your actions on the night in question. Marcus swallowed hard. He wanted to scream, to demand that they see him as more than a stereotype, more than a line in a police report. But screaming wouldn't change anything. Marines don't beg, they endure. And so he stood there, shoulders square, eyes forward, his silence saying more than words ever could. The prosecutor gathered his papers with finality, as if the case was already decided. He sat down with a smirk barely hidden at the corner of his lips. To him, this was just another win waiting to be claimed. But Marcus knew something no one else in that room expected. He knew that this was not the end. Somewhere beyond the courtroom doors, justice was coming carried, not by law, not by procedure, but by a figure who would change everything. The tension in the room grew heavier, pressing against every chest, suffocating every breath. The case had been framed, the accusations laid out, the silence of bystanders thick in the air. Marcus stood at the center of it all, humiliated, accused, and yet unbroken. Because deep down, even though they didn't see it yet, Marcus knew the tide was about to turn, and when it did, no one would ever forget this day. The prosecutor's words still lingered in the air like smoke, but what carried even more weight was the silence that followed. The courtroom was a theater of contrasts. Every face, every gesture, every whisper or lack of one told a story of its own. Marcus could feel the eyes pressing against him, some curious, some cold, some quietly aching. In the gallery, a young man in a crisp suit leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a smirk tugging at his lips as if he enjoyed watching Marcus stand accused. To him, Marcus wasn't a hero or a marine. He was just another defendant, another black man in handcuffs. A woman beside him clutched her purse a little tighter, her eyes darting between Marcus and the officers by the wall. She wasn't sure. What she feared more, what Marcus might have done, or what the truth might reveal about the people she trusted in uniform. But not everyone looked away with suspicion. In the second row, an older woman sat stiffly, her weathered hands gripping the handle of a leather bag. She was a widow, her silver hair pinned neatly, a folded American flag pin fastened to her blouse. She knew what service meant. She knew what it cost. Her late husband's photograph was likely tucked inside her bag, the memory of his sacrifice never far from reach. And as she watched Marcus stand there, accused of crimes that didn't match, the dignity in his eyes, she whispered under her breath, almost inaudible, "This isn't right." Her words didn't travel far, but Marcus caught them. His ears, trained by years of listening for the faintest sound in hostile terrain, didn't miss whispers others would overlook. For a fleeting second, he felt less alone. Someone saw him. Someone understood. Elsewhere, in the back row, a man in work boots shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't a veteran. He didn't know Marcus, had never met him. But he had seen enough in life to recognize injustice when it unfolded in front of him. He looked down at the floor, guilt gnawing at him because he knew he would do nothing. Speaking up meant attention, maybe consequences, and he didn't have the courage. Silence, though shameful, was easier. Near the front, a teenager leaned forward, his phone hidden just under the bench as he recorded quietly. His wide eyes darted between Marcus and the officers, capturing every detail. He wasn't brave enough to raise his voice in that room, but maybe, just maybe, he believed he could raise it later, when the footage spoke louder than he ever could. Then there were the officers themselves. The two who had arrested Marcus stood against the wall, smugness etched into their posture. One crossed his arms, the other tapped a finger against his belt. Both of them wearing the same expression, self. They had written the reports, framed the story, and in their minds, the courtroom was only a formality. They believed the system would protect them, as it always had, and yet, even among them, there was unease. A younger officer, sitting near the back in uniform, kept his gaze fixed on Marcus. He had read the arrest report, but now that he saw Marcus in person, his composure, his discipline, his quiet dignity, he wasn't so sure. Doubt flickered in his eyes. But doubt, unspoken, is as powerless as silence. Marcus felt all of it. He could read a room the same way he once read the terrain of a battlefield. Every silence, every glance, every murmur told him who stood with him and who stood against him. But the worst of all were the people who did nothing, who sat frozen, who chose comfort over truth. He had seen that before, not in a courtroom, but in war zones, when civilians watched from windows as soldiers fought, too afraid to choose a side. He lifted his chin, scanning the crowd. For a moment, his eyes locked with the widow's. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but to Marcus it was everything. It was a reminder that not all voices had been silenced. Not all hearts were blind. Still, the overall weight of the room leaned against him. The air was thick with quiet judgment, heavy with indifference. His mother once told him silence was a weapon sharper than any blade, colder than any bullet. Now he understood. As the judge shuffled papers and the prosecutor prepared to continue, Marcus stood there in the crossfire of stares and silence. Every bystander in that courtroom had already made a choice. Some chose cruelty, some chose fear. Some chose to avert their gaze, and a precious few chose compassion. The hardest part was knowing that their choices could decide his fate as much as the law itself. And so he waited, his heart steady but his pride burning, for the moment when all those whispers, all that silence, would be shattered by something no one in that room could ignore. If you had been sitting there, what would you have done? Would you have whispered, stayed silent, or stood up? Answer honestly in the comments, because your answer says more than you realize. The prosecutor's voice kept droning on, but Marcus barely heard the words anymore. The courtroom faded, the polished wood panels, the sharp scent of old paper, the weight of eyes fixed on him, all of it dissolved into a haze. His mind drifted back, pulled against his will, to the places where he had truly learned what it meant to stand tall. The first memory struck hard and fast. A night in Iraq, years ago. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the desert sky cut open by the flashing arcs of tracer rounds. Marcus lay flat on his belly, his cheek pressed against the stock of his rifle, sweat dripping into his eyes. He was calm, snipers always had to be, but the chaos around him was deafening. Mortar pounded in the distance, each explosion rattling the earth beneath him. His brothers depended on his eyes, his steadiness. He remembered sighting a rooftop, where muzzle flashes erupted, enemy fire raining down on his unit pinned in an alley. He squeezed the trigger, slow and deliberate. One shot, then another. The firing stopped. The alley fell quiet enough for his squad to escape. They would never forget that moment. Some of them swore later he had saved their lives. Now, standing in that courtroom, his wrists sore from cuffs that had cut into his skin the night before, Marcus thought of that rooftop. He thought of the calm precision, the responsibility. He thought of how none of that mattered here. To the prosecutor, to the officers, he was not a man who saved lives. He was simply a man to be condemned. Another memory surfaced. Afghanistan, the mountains. Nights so cold they cut into his bones. He and his team huddled in silence, their breath fogging in the thin air. Marcus took the night watch, staring through the scope for hours, his finger hovering near the trigger. He could go days without real sleep, sustained only by discipline and grit. He remembered one particular night, hearing faint movement in the dark, shadows slipping through the trees, insurgents creeping closer. His radio hissed softly, "We're counting on you, Hill." He did not fail them. He never failed them. That night, he became the wall between his brothers and death. But now, in this sterile courtroom, all that sacrifice was invisible. No one here called him brother. No one here looked at him with trust. The same hands that once steadied a rifle to defend his unit were now branded as dangerous. The same eyes that scanned landscapes for threats were now accused of defiance. He remembered another night, one that haunted him most. A convoy ambushed, vehicles on fire, screams ripping through the smoke. Marcus ran toward the flames without thinking, dragging one Marine out, then another. He remembered the heat scorching his skin, the stench of burning fuel. He remembered the weight of a dying man in his arms, whispering, "Don't let me go." Marcus hadn't. He carried him until medics took over. That man lived because Marcus refused to let fear stop him. And yet, here, the court documents said he had resisted, that he was a threat, that he had broken laws. The contrast made Marcus's stomach twist. He had bled for this country. He had lost pieces of himself he could never get back. His nights were filled with shadows that would never leave him, and now his own country looked at him with suspicion instead of gratitude. The widow in the front row watched him closely. Perhaps she saw it the way his shoulders shifted slightly, the faraway look in his eyes. Perhaps she recognized the stare, the way soldiers drift into memories they can't share. She clasped her hands tighter, tears welling in her eyes. She knew. Marcus inhaled slowly, pulling himself back into the present. The prosecutor was still speaking, spinning the narrative. Words like aggressive and uncooperative floated in the air like poisoned darts. Marcus kept his silence, but inside him the fire grew hotter. He thought of the men who had not come home, who would never sit in a courtroom, who would never defend themselves against lies. He thought of the oath he had taken to defend his country, to protect freedom. Freedom. The word stung now. Freedom was what he thought he had fought for, yet here he stood, shackled not by chains anymore, but by prejudice, suspicion, and indifference. Still, he would not break. Marines don't break. He stood tall, jaw tight, eyes locked ahead, even as memories of deserts, mountains, and fire tore through his mind. Because if he could endure nights of endless gunfire, if he could endure carrying brothers through hell itself, then he could endure this. He had to, and somewhere deep inside, he knew this moment, this humiliation, was not the end. Something was coming. He didn't know what yet, but he could feel it, the way a sniper feels the shift of the wind. Before a shot, he would not leave this courtroom defeated. Not today, not ever. If you had lived through those memories, if you had carried those scars, how would you feel standing in Marcus's place? Would you keep silent, or would you let the world know who you were? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because his silence carried meaning, but your voice can carry truth. The judge leaned forward, his robes shifting slightly as he rested his elbows on the bench. His voice carried across the courtroom, deep and deliberate, each word landing like a hammer on stone. Marine or not, the law is the law. The words were meant to sound neutral, procedural, but to Marcus they felt like a sentence in themselves. Marine or not. That phrase cut deep. It erased everything he had ever given. It separated his identity, dividing the man from the uniform, the sacrifice, from the recognition. Marine or not, as if all that mattered was the report in front of the judge. The carefully written narrative by officers who had already decided Marcus's fate. The gallery was silent now. Even the smirks had faded. People leaned forward, just enough to hear what would come next, but not enough to risk being noticed. That was the nature of bystanders. They wanted to witness the storm, but not stand in it. Marcus's attorney whispered urgently at his side, urging him to stay calm, to let the process play out. But Marcus wasn't a man made for silence in the face of injustice. He had spent too many years watching over others, too many nights making split-second choices to save lives. Silence had never been an option. His fists tightened at his sides, nails digging into his palms. He felt the humiliation burn inside him, spreading like wildfire. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from betrayal. Was this justice? Was this what he had fought for overseas? He remembered standing on a ridge in Afghanistan, wind tearing at his face as he scanned the valley below. He remembered thinking about home, picturing the streets of his childhood, the voice of his mother, the warmth of family dinners. He remembered believing, with absolute certainty, that everything he endured was worth it because it was for them, for the people back home, for the promise that his sacrifice meant something. Now, in this courtroom, that promise was being stripped. away with a single sentence. Marine or not, his voice cracked through the silence before he even realized he was speaking. The law, he said, his tone steady but sharp. I have lived by the law. I have followed it in places where no law existed. I have bled for it. I have carried brothers through fire for it. And now I stand here accused of crimes I did not commit by the very system I swore to protect. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The widow in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The young man with the phone adjusted his angle, recording every word. The officers by the wall shifted uneasily, their confidence flickering, though they masked it quickly with crossed arms and blank stares. The judge's face remained stern, unyielding. He tapped his gavel once, more out of habit than necessity. Mr. Hill, you will respect this court. This is not a forum for speeches. This is about the charges against you. Marcus straightened, every muscle in his body taut with controlled rage. Respect. I've shown respect all my life. Respect. 2 commanders who gave impossible orders. Respect to civilians who spat at me when I came home in uniform. Respect to laws that did not always respect me back. And now you tell me that the law is the law, as though it is blind, as though it cannot be bent or broken by prejudice. The air thickened. You could feel the shift, the tension crawling across the room like electricity. Some in the gallery looked down at their shoes, unable to face his words. Others stared openly, drawn to the fire in his voice, realizing they were witnessing something, rare truth spoken without fear, dignity refusing to bow. The judge raised a hand as if to silence him, but Marcus continued, his voice rising, not in anger but in unshakable conviction. I have killed so that others may live. I have stood in places no one else dared stand. And yet here, in my own country, I am treated as less than a man. If this is justice, then tell me what exactly did I fight for? The widow's soft sob broke through the silence. The young officer sitting at the back of the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched. The young man recording leaned closer, his heart racing. For a moment, even the judge faltered. His pen paused over his notepad, his eyes narrowing not in judgment but in thought. Marcus had forced him to confront something he could not easily dismiss, but still, the gavel came down. Enough, the judge said firmly, his voice regaining authority. This court will proceed according to the law. Emotional appeals will not influence this trial. Marcus fell silent, but not because he had been silenced. He knew the truth was already out there now, hanging in the air, impossible to take back. His words had cut into the silence like a blade. Whether they admitted it or not, everyone in that room felt it. He sat down slowly, his breathing controlled, his eyes locked forward. He would not break. He would not surrender. But inside, the question clawed at him. Was this truly the country he had bled for? Was this what justice meant, that a Marine sniper could be dragged into court, accused without proof, his service dismissed with a wave of a hand? The breaking point had come and gone, but Marcus was still standing. And though the judge thought he had restored order, Marcus knew that order would not last. Something else was coming, something greater than the law. And when it entered that room, no one would forget it. If you were Marcus, could you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken your truth no matter the cost? Share your answer in the comments, because sometimes silence is the loudest form of surrender. The gavel had just struck, the sound still echoing faintly across the chamber when the atmosphere of the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a change in the air that no one could quite name. Marcus felt it before he saw it the way a Marine senses movement in the distance, the way instincts whisper before the eye confirms. He straightened unconsciously, his body remembering battlefields, his mind sharpening as though preparing for contact. The prosecutor was gathering his papers, again, lips curling with the smug certainty of a man convinced the trial was already his. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable, as if the outcome was already etched in stone. The gallery was restless, caught between whispers and silence. And then the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The creak was louder than it should have been, carrying through the stillness, making heads turn. The bailiff, who stood by the doors, stiffened immediately, his eyes snapping wide as though he had just seen something or someone he hadn't expected. Boots echoed against the marble floor, deliberate, steady, each step resonating through the chamber like a drum beat. People in the gallery began to shift, murmurs rippling like a wave as they craned their necks to see. The prosecutor stopped mid-motion, his fingers frozen around the stack of papers. Even the judge paused, pen hovering above his notes. The figure who entered wore a uniform that commanded silence without a single word. 4 gleaming stars shone on his shoulders, ribbons spread across his chest like a tapestry of sacrifice and history. His posture was carved from iron, his gaze unyielding, the kind of presence that silences chaos by merely existing. He was no ordinary officer. He was a 4-star general, the kind of man who rarely walked into a civilian courtroom, the kind of man who could shift the weight of an entire room with a single breath. Every veteran in the gallery recognized it instantly. The older man in the back row, who had stayed quiet until now, instinctively straightened in his seat, his spine snapping, upright with muscle memory and respect. The widow clutched her hands together, her lips trembling. Even the younger officer sitting in the back lowered his gaze, the instinct of deference overcoming hesitation. The general's boot struck the floor with calm finality as he moved down the aisle. The murmurs faded to silence. People stopped, breathing for fear they might disturb the gravity of his presence. The officers who had arrested Marcus stood taller, though their eyes betrayed unease. Smugness vanished from their faces, replaced with a flicker of uncertainty. Marcus's heart pounded, but not from fear. For the first time since the night of his arrest, he felt the fire inside him cool slightly, replaced by something else: hope. He knew this man. Not personally, perhaps, but by reputation, by presence, by the kind of authority that only came with years of sacrifice and leadership. Marcus had served under men like him, men who bore not just stars, but the weight of thousands of lives. The general walked to the front, each step echoing, and stopped near the defense table. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He didn't look at the officers. He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes steady, acknowledging him not as a defendant, not as a criminal, but as a Marine. The silence was unbearable now, thick enough to crush every whisper. The judge cleared his throat, shifting in his chair, uncharacteristically unsettled. "Sir," he began cautiously, "this is a civilian proceeding." "May I ask what?" But the general raised a hand, calm but commanding, and the judge stopped. Speaking immediately, the entire courtroom understood. Whatever was about to happen was bigger than procedure, bigger than law, bigger than the petty accusations on paper. The general's voice finally broke the silence, deep and deliberate. "Your Honor, before you continue, there is something this court must hear, something about the man you see before you." The prosecutor shifted in his seat, uncomfortable for the first time that day. The officers along the wall exchanged nervous glances, The gallery leaned forward, unable to look away, and Marcus felt his chest tighten. For the first time in days, he felt seen, because this was no ordinary interruption. This was the moment everything changed, and no one in that room would ever forget it. If you had been there, watching those doors swing open, feeling that silence descend, what would have gone through your mind? Would you have felt relief, fear? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this moment wasn't just dramatic, it was history walking through the door. The general stood tall, his presence consuming the room like a tide no one could resist. His uniform caught the light, medals glinting faintly. But it wasn't the stars on his shoulders or the ribbons on his chest that commanded attention. It was his eyes. They were steady, unflinching, filled with the weight of decades of service and the burden of men he had led into and out of hell. He looked at Marcus first, not as a defendant, not as a man in chains, but as a Marine. Recognition passed between them without a single word, an unspoken brotherhood forged by duty, not circumstance. Marcus, who had been standing alone in that courtroom for hours, finally felt the crushing weight on his chest lift. Someone had entered who understood, someone who could not be swayed by prejudice or lies. The general turned toward the judge, his voice carrying like thunder, yet measured with precision. "Your Honor, I will not waste your time with legal arguments. That is not my place. But I cannot stand silent while the name and honor of one of my Marines are dragged through the mud of this courtroom." The room rippled. A few people gasped, others leaned forward. Even the judge's hand trembled slightly as it adjusted the papers before him. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his once confident posture unraveling. He tried to interject, his voice strained. "General, with all due respect," but the general cut him off with a glance so sharp it felt like a blade. His tone hardened. "Respect? You speak of respect, counselor. Then respect the sacrifices this man has made. Respect the years he gave to a country that too often forgets the cost of freedom. Marcus Hill is not a criminal. He is a Marine sniper who carried the weight of protecting men who never made it home. I know his record, I know his service, and I know the debt this nation owes him." The gallery erupted in whispers, a wave of voices that couldn't be contained. Some were astonished, some nodded fiercely, vindicated. The young widow clutched her tissue tighter, tears streaming freely now. The older veteran in the back row had his jaw clenched, eyes glistening. Even the young man recording on his phone lowered it slightly, too mesmerized to keep filming. The general stepped forward, closer to the bench. His voice softened but grew heavier, each word sinking deep. "Marcus Hill served under my command in Afghanistan. I sent men like him into fire, into the jaws of death, and he never once faltered. Do you know what it means to hold the life of your brothers in your hands, night after night, with the knowledge that one mistake means none of them return home? This man carried that burden, and he carried it with honor." The judge leaned back, silent, his face unreadable but his composure cracking. The prosecutor's face drained of color. The officers who had arrested Marcus avoided the general's eyes, their once firm stance now faltering. And then the general did something no one expected. He turned, slowly, deliberately, and faced Marcus. The silence deepened, as though the entire room was holding its breath. His voice, when he spoke, was stripped of formality, heavy with emotion. "Marcus, I owe you an apology." Marcus's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't have imagined hearing those words. Not here, not like this. The general continued, his tone breaking slightly, but never losing strength. I owe you an apology for a country that has not treated you as it should, for a system that looks at the color of your skin before it looks at the medals on your chest, for the way you've been humiliated, disrespected, and placed in chains when you should be saluted. That is not justice, that is not honor, and for that, on behalf of the institution you've served so faithfully, I am sorry. A gasp broke from the gallery. The widow sobbed openly now, her head bowed. The veteran in the back lowered his face into his hands. Even one of the officers near the wall swallowed hard, his jaw flexing as he fought something inside himself. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He had endured insults, humiliation, nights in a cell, the weight of prejudice pressing against him. But this moment of truth, this recognition of his pain cut through him deeper than anything else. Not because it healed him entirely, but because it told him he was not invisible. The general stepped closer, his voice steady once more. The Marines do not abandon their own, and I will not stand by while you are abandoned here. He turned back to the judge, his voice booming. Your Honor, this trial is more than paperwork. It is about whether we as a nation stand by the men and women who stood by us. If we cannot protect them in this room, how dare we ask them to protect us on the battlefield? The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The weight of the words hung heavy, pressing down on every person in that courtroom. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, not to shut out the world, but to steady himself. For the first time since his arrest, he felt like the truth had finally broken through the walls of lies and prejudice. The general had done what no one else in that room had the courage to do. He had spoken the truth out loud, with no fear of consequence, and in that truth lay the beginning of justice. If you had been in that courtroom, would you have stood with Marcus? Or would you have stayed silent, like so many in the gallery, afraid to be noticed? Tell me in the comments, because silence can be as powerful as action. Sometimes it saves, and sometimes it destroys. The courtroom was frozen in silence after the general's words, as though time itself had paused to reckon with the weight of what had just been spoken. The air felt thick, almost impossible to breathe, and every eye in the chamber shifted back and forth between the four-star general, the judge, and Marcus. The apology still hung in the air, echoing louder than the gavel, louder than the accusations, louder than the chains that had once bound Marcus's wrists. The judge's face had gone pale, his lips pressed into a tight line. He had presided over hundreds of cases, perhaps thousands, but never had his courtroom been pierced so deeply by truth, delivered with such force. His pen lay forgotten on the bench, his hand unmoving. For a moment, he wasn't a figure of authority, he was simply a man confronted with the raw humanity he had nearly overlooked. He cleared his throat, though the sound was weak, almost hesitant. His voice, usually booming with certainty, trembled slightly when he finally spoke. General, this is highly unusual. These proceedings, he paused, his words faltering as he searched for footing, for control. The authority he once wore like a robe was slipping. The court appreciates your service and the service of Mr. Hill. But we must remember this is a civilian trial. Emotions, while understandable, cannot dictate the outcome. The prosecutor latched onto those words desperately, like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. He straightened in his chair, his voice cracking slightly but forced into bravado. Yes, Your Honor, with all due respect to the general's dramatic display, we must not forget the facts at hand. This man resisted arrest, but the words died in his throat. Because the gallery erupted, not with shouts, not with chaos, but with a collective, unmistakable sound, disbelief. A low rumble of murmurs, scoffs, and the unmistakable hiss of disapproval. It wasn't wild, it wasn't loud, but it was more damning than any protest. The gallery had chosen its side, and it was no longer with the prosecutor. The widow in the second row shook her head fiercely, her voice breaking as she whispered, "How dare you?" The older veteran clenched his fists against the bench in front of him, muttering something that carried just loud enough. "That boy bled for this country, and you treat him like a criminal." Even the younger onlookers, the ones who had been skeptical, who had come to watch like it was some kind of spectacle, were shaken. Phones that had been recording with idle curiosity were now aimed with trembling hands, because they understood something monumental was unfolding, something history itself might remember. Marcus sat in the defendant's chair, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He hadn't moved since the general's apology. Not because he was stunned into paralysis, but because he was holding himself still with every ounce of discipline left in him. Inside, his chest was heaving, his pulse loud in his ears. He had endured humiliation without flinching, but hearing the truth spoken so plainly had cracked something open inside him. He wasn't broken, he was burning. He turned his gaze toward the prosecutor, his voice low but audible, carried by the silence. "You speak of facts. You think chains on my wrists erase the years I carried a rifle for this country. You think your paper reports outweigh the nights I prayed for my brothers to make it home alive. If those are your facts, then your truth isn't truth at all." The prosecutor's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked toward the judge for rescue, but the judge wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were on Marquesand, then on the general. The judge leaned back, exhaling slowly, his mask of neutrality breaking into something human. He rubbed his temples with one hand, as though the weight of his own conscience had just been dropped on him like a stone. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. "This court cannot ignore what has been said here today. We cannot ignore service. We cannot ignore sacrifice." He paused, and for a brief second, his eyes flickered toward Marcus, not as a defendant but as a man. "We cannot ignore humanity." The gallery broke into scattered applause, small at first, hesitant then growing louder as more people joined in. It wasn't wild celebration, it was a release, a crack in the wall of oppression that had been suffocating the room. The officers at the wall stiffened uncomfortably, unsure whether to silence the gallery or let the moment breathe. The general didn't move, didn't even blink. He stood tall, a statue of resolve, his presence commanding without force. Marcus bowed his head slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement of the support, of the moment, of the weight finally shifting. Still, beneath the applause and the emotion, tension remained. Justice had not yet been declared. Freedom had not yet been restored. Marcus knew this wasn't over. One apology, one crack in the mask, was not enough to erase the system that had put him here in the first place. But, for the first time, he believed the system might bend. The judge lifted his gavel, the sound echoing sharply as he brought it down, not to silence, but to restore order. "This court will reassess. When we return, we will continue. But let it be known," his voice strengthened as he spoke, "this court has heard, and this court remembers." The gallery quieted, but the energy remained. Eyes burned with fire, hands shook with adrenaline. The prosecutors slumped back, defeated, but not yet finished. The general turned once more toward Marcus, his gaze steady, silent but full of meaning. Hold on. This isn't over, but you are not alone anymore. And Marcus finally allowed himself a breath. A deep, steady breath that felt like the first step out of the shadows. If you were sitting in that gallery, what would you have done? Would you have clapped? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have stood up and spoken? Drop your answer in the comments, because in moments like these, silence isn't neutral. It's a choice. The gavel's echo faded into the air, but the weight of the moment lingered like smoke after a fire. The court recessed, people shifted in their seats, but no one truly left their emotions behind. The tension had only been paused, not erased. The judge's words this court has heard, and this court remembers, hung like a promise that had yet to be fulfilled. Marcus sat still, his body rigid, his thoughts racing. For days he had felt like a man drowning in quicksand. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. But now, after the general's apology and the judge's shaken words, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. The ground beneath him shifting. Not steady yet, but shifting. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply, as if preparing himself for the storm that would return once the recess ended. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The murmurs hadn't disappeared. They'd grown louder, bolder, as though the people in the gallery had found their courage too. Officers lined the walls again, their jaws tight, but even they looked unsettled. Something had broken open in the room earlier, and now there was no way to stuff it back into silence. The prosecutor stood first, his face pale but his chin lifted in stubborn defiance. He shuffled his papers, his hand trembling slightly, though he tried to mask it. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firmer than it felt, "I must remind the court that sympathy cannot replace the rule of law. Mr. Hill resisted arrest. He endangered officers. His service record, while commendable, cannot excuse his actions in this matter. The law must be applied equally, or it ceases to have meaning." The words rang hollow, even to himself. A ripple of disapproval cut through the gallery. The widow's tear-streaked face twisted in disbelief, and the veteran muttered something sharp under his breath. Phones lifted again, capturing every word. The prosecutor cleared his throat, growing red, but pressed on. "If we excuse violence against authority because of military service, we open the door to chaos. Discipline must be upheld. The uniform does not make one untouchable." The general stepped forward, his presence silencing the murmurs instantly. His voice was calm, controlled, but every syllable landed like a strike. "Chaos, disciplini. Do you dare lecture me about discipline? I have commanded men in combat, counselor. I have ordered men into the line of fire, and I have written letters to their families when they did not come home. Do not speak to me about discipline while you stand here trying to destroy the honor of a Marine who did nothing but serve faithfully." The gallery erupted this time with applause and gasps. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice sharp. "Order. This is still a court of law." The room quieted, though the energy crackled like lightning just beneath the surface. Marcus rose, to his feet slowly. His lawyer touched his arm, urging caution, but Marcus shook his head. For too long, others had spoken over him, spoken for him. It was time his own voice filled the chamber. He turned toward the judge, his voice steady, his posture tall. "Your Honor, I don't deny I raised my voice to those officers. I don't deny I stood my ground when I was treated like less than a man. But I did not resist because I thought I was above the law. I resisted because I am a man who deserves the same respect you would give anyone else in this courtroom." He paused, letting the words settle, then continued, his voice breaking with emotion. I wore this country's uniform not because it made me untouchable, but because I believed in something greater than myself. I believed in freedom, in dignity, in justice. Yet when I came home, I found myself in chains, judged by the color of my skin before the content of my service. Tell me, Your Honor, is that justice? The judge stared at him, lips pressed together, eyes heavy. The silence was suffocating, but Marcus didn't waver. He stood there like a soldier awaiting his fate. But this time the battlefield was a courtroom. Finally, the judge exhaled and adjusted his glasses. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Mr. Hill, this court has weighed the facts. Yes, there was an altercation. Yes, voices were raised. But the evidence does not support the charges of resisting arrests or endangering officers. The facts reveal not a violent criminal, but a man who was provoked, humiliated, and restrained unjustly. He paused, his throat tightening as if the words themselves were heavy. This court finds you not guilty. The words hit the room like a tidal wave. The gallery erupted cheers, cries, applause thundered through the chamber. The widow clapped her hands together, sobbing openly. The veteran rose to his feet and saluted Marcus, tears in his eyes. Phones shook as they recorded, capturing history. The officers along the wall shifted uncomfortably, some glaring, others bowing their heads as though ashamed. Marcus stood frozen, the words echoing in his mind, not guilty. He blinked hard, as though afraid the sound would vanish if he let go. Slowly, his shoulders dropped, the weight of months of humiliation sliding off him. The general stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus. With deliberate care, he extended his hand not as a superior officer, but as a brother. Marcus hesitated, for just a moment, then gripped it firmly. The general leaned close, his voice low but meant for all to hear. Welcome home, Marine. The room erupted again, louder, freer, unstoppable. The applause wasn't just for Marcus, it was for justice, for dignity reclaimed, for the crack of light breaking through years of shadow. Marcus turned toward the gallery, his eyes scanning the faces, some strangers, some supporters, all witnesses. He raised his chin, his voice strong. I am not asking for pity. I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking for what every man and woman in this country deserves: respect, equality, justice, and I will not stop demanding it, not just for me, but for every soul who has been silenced. The judge, still seated, looked down at his bench, his expression heavy, almost chastened. The prosecutor had slumped entirely, his case crumbling like ash in his hands. The gallery, however, rose to its feet, the applause becoming a standing ovation. For Marcus, the chains that had bound him were gone not just from his wrists, but from his spirit. He walked out of that courtroom not as a defendant, not as a broken man, but as a Marine who had faced a different kind of battlefield and refused to bow. As he reached the door, the general at his side, Marcus glanced back once more. The silence, between gavel strikes, the echo of applause, the faces shining with tears and pride, was a moment he would never forget. A moment that wasn't just about him, but about everyone who had ever been silenced, shackled, or shamed. Justice had been served, dignity restored, and a message written into the walls of that courtroom forever. Equality is not a privilege, it is a right. If you believe in that message, let your voice be heard. Drop a comment, share this story, and never stay silent in the face of injustice, because silence is not neutral. it is consent, and justice demands more than silence.